Amen. Thank you, Tom. Well, I'm just going to share with you what I shared with the church back about 2 years ago called Vision 2020, which is the vision God had given us as a church to start churches and multiply. I started with the text in the book of Acts talking about Saul and what had happened to him. And then I shared this with the church. God has given the church a purpose that impacts you. And I gave them a purpose statement. The purpose of our church is to lead all people to know Christ, to grow in Christ, and to go for Christ. And that's our purpose statement. You see it all over our campus, and we've tried to really saturate our folks with this awareness that we're here to know, grow, and go. And then we shared a vision statement that we have to give all of Central Florida access to the gospel through multiplying believers, media, servant ministries, and a church planting movement. And so that's what our vision is. The purpose is what we're going to be. The vision is what we're going to do. And then I mentioned Acts 1:8 to them and how that we're called to reach our city, our community. We're called to reach the neighboring people and the near people, the neglected people, and the next people, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. And so God's given us a purpose that impacts you, and then God has given the church a plan that includes you. I shared with them the way we intend to do our ministry as a church body so that they would understand what we are doing and the way we do it, and I'll share some more of that with you in just a minute. But then finally, God has given the church priorities that inspire you, things that would move you to work together. So in 2010, I gave us some goals then. We started another service in 2010, trying to engage everyone in a 5-mile radius and initially engage everyone in Central Florida. We were able to start another service in 2010. Our church grew about 10% in 2010. We baptized 152 people that year and were able to achieve those objectives. In 2011, another worship location that was our priority. And until 2020, which we got a vision to have 10 different locations. And you say, well, what are these going to look like? Some of them may be a satellite, but most of them, what we're trying to move them to is church plants, new congregations, 25 services, and $50 million over those years. So the purpose to know Christ, I explained to our people how we do that. We lead people to know Christ really through two different ways: worship experiences and witnessing encounters. Provide multiple different venues whereby our people can share the gospel and get out to folks. So that's how we lead people to know Christ, then to grow in Christ. Our discovery class is sort of the beginning place. Once they come to Christ and they're baptized, then incorporating them into Sunday school. We call it life groups now. And then we carry them a little further with University of Christian Training, which doesn't meet every week like Sunday school does, but it's a little deeper. And then when we're ready to move them into a real high level of ministry, our final stage is what we call the 12. That's a high level accountability. And then to go, we do that in ministry and we do it in missions. And so explain that to our congregation, each one of those. So we called it Vision 2020 with that purpose in mind. And so we outlined all of this to our folks. Now, I will tell you that 2011 we decided to start our first church, and we had a previous campus in Pine Hills. That's from where we came, in a distressed community there, and we wanted to go back into that region. So we spotlighted the Kirkman Road area, which has 28,000 people that live on Kirkman Road, just right there in that area, right down Kirkman from Universal Studios back to Valencia. That is just the the densest population area that you will see around our community. In fact, if you go to that Walmart, it is quite an experience to fight your way in the door and to get back out, and children everywhere and young people, and really very little work going on in that area. And so we've got a church planner, we've got a core group. They are meeting monthly now together, and it's been a great work. We've baptized folks there. The next church plant that we're planning to do, in fact, we wanted to do it this year, is in Claremont. And God just didn't give me liberty on it this year to call a church planter. I talked to one of those, didn't have liberty on it. There were some things that we need to take care of here. And so next year, that's going to be our second location and second service. So we'd have the Kirkman Community Church, and we would have the Claremont work as well. And so that's what we've been doing. But Vision 2020 is 10 services, 10 locations, 25 services, and $50 million over that 10-year period. That's what our vision is. That's what we've shared with our people, and that's what we're trying to do. One of the things that we've learned with our first church start with Kirkman, we've learned some things, and we're going to start, our core group is going to be a life group where they meet every week together during the Sunday school hour while they're praying about it and preparing for it and going out there on the weekends and doing ministry there and surveying and preparing, and so that they're already together for a time before they move, relocate, start some sort of public launch or start a Sunday morning ministry. We also want it to be an organic work to where they're starting Bible studies in that area and raising up different Bible studies like we've done at Kirkman, to where when we do launch something out there, a service, there's already a strong core that's been well developed. And so we've just really, that strategy and that the way to actually pull that off is something we've just brought together in recent weeks. And in January, we'll start our Claremont Life Group. We've already had some small group meetings out there and prayer meetings, but just hadn't felt like things were just right. Sometimes as a church, when you're planning churches, you know you need to have your house in order before you export that. And this last year, we were working on getting that ready to go on with the next step, which is wonderful. When you have a vision, it's like a sense of accountability to follow that vision. So that's what it was, and just wanted to show it to you. Brother Tom.
Well, let me ask you a couple questions. You were talking about one time, and I don't know if Mark probably may know this, and I should, but you were talking about someone to come on staff and kind of lead your effort in those 25 worship services, the effort of the 10. Did that come about, or how did that?
That's what Wes is doing at the current time.
You want to tell us?
Wes is our mom. He's our minister of missions. But he's worked hand in hand with our church planner, our first one, and Kevin Adams, who was on our staff. He was on our he was on our staff teaching in our school, and now he's our church planner in Kirkman. And so as we add planners, Wes is the one who works with them primarily. And but mobilizing your people to do ministry through that, to where they feel a sense of ownership of it, and you let them have legitimacy. They report to your folks, they speak to your folks, and it just becomes a part of who you are, that we're doing a work here and there and somewhere else. So.
Well, I want you to hear from someone that all that we've been teaching about this morning, and all we'll finish up this afternoon. Here's it in practice. Here's what we're talking about, how you do that, and how do you get moving? You start with the one, and I really believe at the 10 and the 25 I believe that's going to wholeheartedly happen. And so go ahead, Mike, and if you would repeat that, whatever he asked you. So
okay.
You're the only one recording.
All right.
What would you say to a sponsoring, a pastor who's considering planting, seeing the need in this area to plant church? What would you say to him in terms of, from a pastor's perspective of preparing for that, preparing to sponsor church? What would you just tell the pastor about your experience based on your
Well, I think it needs to come out of his heart. I think if it's not out of his heart, then the people will realize that. If you just assign that to a staff member and say, well, this is kind of a little part of our missions program, that it's not going to really become a part of your people. But if it comes out of the pastor's heart, the people will buy into it. The people will sacrifice for it. The people will love that work, and the people will migrate to those works and actually begin to serve there, participate in them. I would also say that a pastor can't be afraid to invest his people in something like that. You can't be afraid that it's going to hinder you or hurt you or set you back as a congregation to invest your folks in that. The third thing I would say is you need to be very careful about the leadership that you pick over that work. Because when I was at a previous church, I was the minister of missions at Kirby Woods Baptist Church in Memphis. And we were starting 18 different churches across the country at that time. We had won Key Church of the Year when we were with HMB. I think we give about $1 million. We give now about almost $2 million to missions a year at Kirby. It's just incredible what all they do. But we had a church plant that we started in our community, and we brought in a planter, and it just did not work out very well because of the planter. I think you just need to be wise and careful about your planter. You need somebody that you're very comfortable with, somebody that you're totally at peace with, and that's that way it'll be a win-win for both works. If not, you will end up doing something that will set you back as a pastor. And just because you've had one bad experience doesn't mean you'll have a lot of those. Are you kidding? Most of them are going to be good, but the enemy's going to try to discourage you. And so he will take one and try to get you to give up on the vision if you're not careful. Now, we've not had that here. We've not had a bad experience. We've had great experience. But some of that's because I learned the hard way. And one of the reasons we did not move this year into doing something is because I had some hesitancy. And I learned from my first experience at Kirby that I was not going to move forward with hesitancy. I was going to wait until the time is right. And then when the time is right and the person is right, then you move. So that's what I'd say.
Well, I appreciate so much. I know you're busy, but we have great churches, and our large churches, our small churches have always been willing to help with GOBA. And Clayton, from the very get-go, from the time I first met him, he's been an encouragement to planting churches, and I believe we will see all those planted. And I think God might even have something that none of us could ever dream of, and maybe a few more coming out of those churches at the first initial churches. Probably by the time the last churches are planted, they might be into the planting of churches. And wouldn't that be a phenomenal deal to think about in that? So I just wanted to, he's very faithful to not only GOBA, Florida Baptist Convention, but some of you may not know, but Clayton has, his doctorate is in missiology. So you think about some of the strategy that goes into church planning. He's a step ahead in some areas because he's been about missiology for a long, long time, and he's been a real encouragement to GOBA and really to all our churches. And he said to me a little while ago, he says, "I will say yes," and that's his heart. So now, how many of you wish you had that voice for preaching? All right, thank you, brother. God bless
Thank you, Brother Tom.
Thank you so much. I want to give you a commercial. Rod's going to come up, and Rod, if you'll take from Clayton your mic, I'm going to give a commercial. In your kit, you have the Renovate National Church Revitalization Conference. I know you came for a church planning conference, but I want to tell you about what's happening next year, November 4, 5, and 6, here at Aloma Community Church here in the Greater Orlando Baptist Association. We will be having, we're praying that we'll see over 1,000 people coming together to raise the conversation in the area of church revitalization, and we'll be talking about it. We have national leaders from Southern Baptists, from United Methodists, from Presbyterians. We have Christian Church. It is going to be a gathering that every year meets annually. Brother Mike over here is the leader of the church, executive pastor, and he's the one that is hosting us, not him by by himself totally, but my home church. And so we'll be looking forward. And if you are doing anything or want to learn in the area of revitalization, we'd like to ask you to put that on your counters. Inside your kit, you have one of our registration cards. The website goes live in just a few days. You can go to it right now sitting in Goba, but Renovate will have its own conference site in just about another 3 weeks. So put it on your counter and tell your pastor about it. If you need more of those little cards, there's plenty out there in the registration. Take some of those home and share them out. We're praying that we will see about 125 directors of missions from across the United States at it, and we will see over 1,000 pastors and church leaders and lay people at it. I mean, I look at the breakouts and the list that's already there, and it's not even a completed list, but even if you went to one of those sessions alone, it could bless your church for the next 3 to 5 years just seeing God do that. And when you gather together for 95 breakouts, 5 main sessions, it is going to be a climate-rich area for the cause of church revitalization. So mark that down, and we'll stop giving the commercial. And Brother Rod, are you enjoying Rodney, by the way? You know, except for the bald head jokes, I'm enjoying him too. So anyway, come on back, Rod.
Okay, you can take your computer, Tom.
Oh.
The whole last session, Tom was whining. You're using my computer. I don't have my computer. I can't check my Facebook page.
That's a lie. Here you go.
Okay, I don't think he said anything about Facebook. I think he was still on MySpace.
You know it's being a friend if it dogs you like that, you know? Let me unhook your PowerPoint and you talk while I...
Okay, all I've got to do is plug in here.
Oh, you got them
Yeah,
there?
yeah. I'm using a PC, so it's still easy to do.
And this is one of my best friends. Isn't this terrible? Go ahead, if you have a question.
And I'm just, this is just a thought. You were mentioning about baby showers and things like that. And, suppose if you advertise something in a local paper, you have an affinity with people in the community, people know you, you know, you're indigenous, and they know this church plant pastor and some of the people. Suppose you made an announcement or something like that in the local paper, and during tax time, people just gave to it because they, you know, they wanted to underwrite it. They may give anything. Does that sound too extreme?
You know, I have come to the conclusion that God is beyond being able to accomplish the extreme. The question seems to be, what if you were to advertise or promote somehow in the community that a new church is being planted, that you're having this baby shower or you're doing some type of event, and people start just responding? What I found is our greatest sometimes hindrance is communication, getting the word out. I have to be sensitive to time, but folks, we have forgotten the power of inviting people to be a part of something. Okay? We've forgotten. Now, obviously, you only want to invite people to something that's worth being invited to. I really do stand by what I was saying. We actually had a church plant for 18 months. We just, no evangelism. This is unhealthy. And our prayer, we were broken because of it, but it was a reality. Everybody knew it. You know, we had to get rid of they started this new church with, 20 people, 18 people to be exact. A family member joined a couple weeks later. We had 20 after the first month. And they started Sunday school, and we had to disband Sunday school because it was so bad. I mean, we had ill-prepared teachers. They came. They weren't ready to teach. Why do that? Because if a visitor shows up, it's saying we don't care. And that would have been what that church would have been. Now, would that church still be alive today? There's a chance that 4 years later, it would still be a church running 20-some people as a family chapel church that was dysfunctional and really giving the kingdom a bad name.
Yeah, I didn't see anything wrong with what you said.
Right.
I thought that was a good. You're developing
So,
healthy people.
right.
Prepare them for growth, not just take anything.
So if you have a healthy church, and that's my caveat, if you have a healthy church, Communicate it. Communicate it. When I came to Kansas City 10 years ago, my wife and I moved from California. We were in a new city. Kansas City has approximately 400 Southern Baptist churches within the Metroplex. And so we made a commitment. We were going to visit every church we were invited to for 6 months prior to determining where we would end up putting our membership. And so we were excited about this. 6 months later, we joined Lenexa Baptist Church. Susan Reed, a secretary, had invited us to the church, and that's why we came. The church was not convenient. It is 30 plus miles away. It takes 38 minutes to get there from our house. You multiply that by how many times a week that you go to church? Why did we go to Lenexa? We were invited, and it was the only church we were invited to. Not one faculty member invited us to their church. Not one student preacher invited us to their church. Not one administrator invited us to the church. Only Susan Reed invited us to church. No, normal. Normal. Now, what does that say about normal Christians? We're crazy. We're missing the best opportunity, and that is inviting people. Now, if you're starting a new church, getting that word out. One of the reasons Rick Warren Saddleback was successful is that he had that volunteer team doing over 10,000, 15,000 letters handwritten to the neighborhood. Now, that was done by a sponsoring church. They were the ones, these partnering churches came together and put together all those letters. That takes time. It takes planning. And by the way, Rick's church was one of the first to use this baby shower strategy. And that was actually something that, again, was in Charles's plan. Hey, we need to get these resources. So let me just say, I think that oftentimes you will find people in the community that will believe in what you're doing. Some of the largest gifts for church planting that I've had the physical opportunity to receive have been from non-Southern Baptists who never came to the church but believed in what we were doing. And it's amazing how often those came when we were at the 11th hour, 59th minute, and you're saying, God, we've exhausted every resource I know, and nobody's coming up with them. And the next thing you know, God just says, Rod, there's a whole army out there that you don't know about, but you've been faithful to share the need they've heard. And that check, the money, the resource would come in at the last minute. And so never be hesitant to share the word. I think we have to do it in a contextually appropriate way, but the resources are out there, and sometimes they're out there in some surprising places.
I believe the Lord's going to bless this particular church, and I really believe it. I'm foolish enough to believe that somebody's going to give us some land. I believe that.
Yeah.
And the reason why they haven't is because they don't know about it yet.
Well, Tom has asked me to share about the top 10 reasons or mistakes church plants make. He has also asked me to share a little bit about bivocationalism, and now that is really on my heart. My heart's not quite as geared towards mistakes, but the reality is we need to learn from them. And so these 10 are ones, as Tom and I were putting together spin-off churches, we sat down and we basically made lists of our experiences. We interviewed pastors, denominational workers. The top 10 mistakes actually came about when we were sitting in a restaurant in Southern California, and we were just listening to everything we had heard over about a week-long conference. And we said, we're hearing these stories over and over again, and that's where that list came from. And Tom turned it into a chapter. He has an amazing way of turning anything that is said into a PowerPoint. And so, the challenge is, though, when you make these mistakes as the sponsoring church leader, if you're the pastor, you're in charge, that mistake is even worse. Now, I just love these kind of pictures. Y'all get that, don't you? If not, ask your friend, okay? But if you're the leader, it is pretty bad when you have these kind of failures. Now, 1 second here, because my PowerPoint is suddenly not advancing. And that's because, there it is. No, it's actually, it was trying to wash itself of the apple germs. Okay. You understand I'm jealous. I don't have an apple. Okay, that's all there is to it. It's just envy. I understand. Okay, the reality is, even under the best circumstances, there will be pitfalls. Y'all understand, if you launch out into the deep as a sponsoring church, there are going to be pitfalls, mistakes, blunders, errors. It's kind of like baseball. Not everybody hits the ball. And yet we don't look at them as failures just because they aren't batting 1,000. What we look at is failure when they quit, they give up, or they just simply are making so many blunders, they start getting these things called errors. What we want to do is minimize those, and we have found these common pitfalls as we were meeting with teams. So here's the top 10 list that came up from our study and research and interviews. The mistake that was very common was number 1, or number 10 in this case. We're going to count them down backwards, a.k.a. Letterman style, would be inadequate, non-existent assessment. Probably the first thing that we discovered is in church plants that we researched that failed, there was a common thread to lack of assessment and fail. Part of the reason is in the assessment process, they have to deal with what's it going to cost. They have to deal with, are they able to build a core team? Do they have a track record of being able to do that? Do they have a track record of staying on task? A track record of staying on budget? A track record of staying faithful to the call? A track record of being able to motivate people to ideas? And if they don't pass that assessment, it's because they don't have a track record, which means they either need more time, more training, maturing the call, or they're just simply not called to be the lead planter. As the sponsoring church, it is critical that you ensure that those that you're sending out have gone through an assessment process. And a quality assessment process is going to identify the strengths and weaknesses of the planter. A weakness does not preclude them from planting. However, when you start seeing things like consistent character, flaws, or even failures, if you start to see basically a makeup that says they're not going to be able to stick to the task, is that the person you want to invest in? And that's a hard call, but it's one that has to be made. And in many cases, we discovered those church plants that failed, there is a significantly disproportionate number of them who never went through an assessment process, or they went through the assessment process, failed it, meaning they did not get a passing score and they were deployed anyways. And so, number 10. Number 9, yes?
Track records. Like, are those, is that put on number 10 as in like not the highest priority or not the highest regards as to?
No, because Tom put our 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, he backed them up. I would say that's the most important one, but I'm following his chapter. We wrote this together, but this is his slide. So we're going to humor the bald-headed guy, okay? Yeah, but let me say, these are all important. And one of the things we could not do is prioritize them to say this is absolutely the most important. Because when we get to number 1, we're going to talk about some spiritual issues. But the reality is, it's all important. Yes, we would say spiritual issues, do you have a vibrant faith and all, is critical. What I would say is these are all important. And again, we're not looking for a perfect person because, well, Jesus has already given us that example. Now our goal is to follow it to the best we can. And Jesus didn't put everybody into leadership. Although, did you notice that he was willing to call some that would make mistakes? I'm not afraid to ask someone to look at someone who has failed in church planting. In Kansas City, the first church planter that I encountered was a gentleman named Chris Pinion. Chris had failed miserably in a church plant in the southern Kansas City area. A lot of money went into it, and after about 2 years, the perfect storm. The church hadn't grown, his funds ran out. What does that usually mean? God's leading him somewhere else, yes. Chris left church planting, but the burning desire never left him. And so he went back to church planting. Now this time he's having to plant without the funding that he had originally. This time he's having to raise more funding, and this time he's having to be bivocational because he doesn't get funding. he is now one of the models that the North American Mission Board is using, and his church, LifeQuest, is one of our Send America churches. God used that experience. So just because someone has failed doesn't mean that you would not look at him. But I think it was a brilliant plan. Because he didn't succeed the first time, they didn't give him money the second time right away. He had to be bivocational. Chris would say that was brilliant. In fact, it would have been kind of silly to fund him knowing that he's already failed once. Why are you going to throw money at a person a second time? This time, God built the church, and everybody could see that it was the Lord that did it. And so let me just simply say, just because someone has failed doesn't mean they're disqualified. Otherwise, we have a lot of folks in Scripture that would not have been able to do what they were doing, like Peter. And then there's some people like me. I'm glad that I'm not based upon my first church plant. Okay? I'm really glad that the world does not base me. In fact, it's kind of just sunk into the parts of history that nobody will ever expose. They probably don't even have records of it because, it lasted for 6 months and it was gone. But did I learn something from it? A lot. So, that's just a part of the reality. This assessment process will help equip you to know your makeup. And if you're truly called, much like Chris Pinion, just because you have that failure behind you, the call doesn't go away and he said, I've got to do this. That's really, sometimes God uses that to where he knew he could not give up. He had to go back to it. And by the way, he might have been successful if he wouldn't have just thrown in the towel when the funding ran out. He learned that. In fact, that's what he teaches in his conferences now when he talks about church planting. He said, guys, when your funding runs out, that's not the sign of God, throw in the towel. That's probably the indication, get a job. But you're going to have to, stay to it. Don't clone the church. Here's a temptation of our sponsoring churches. We want everybody to look like us. The reality is we have to differentiate between the church plant and the sponsoring church. It's complementary to have the membership clone your new member class, clone your small group ministries, clone your music style. Unless you're doing that as a satellite multi-site strategy, which means that you should have been at this conference last year, which was on the multi-site strategy, it's very unwise. The key thing to remember is that you and your church planter are not clones. It's going to be like children. You've got to give them some uniqueness, autonomy, because they're going to be sharing DNA from multiple sources. Your church and the church planter's vision and dream. So don't be a clone. Number 8 is inadequate funding. We talked about that in the last session. And I hope that over lunch you actually took seriously the encouragement to discuss what are the sources that we have in the church. Now, I was sitting having lunch with David and Tom, and I was thinking about my own church. Because right now we're doing quite a bit in church planting. Our church has embraced the Send America strategy. We are one of the Send City churches, and we're excited about what we're doing in missions. And yet I was even thinking about my own Sunday school class and thought, I'm teaching a class right now. I know we can do more. In fact, I know there are some specifics that because I've been in church planting that are kind of being overlooked in our strategy. Little things like making sure that the church planter will get a surprise check in the mail, about Christmas time. Because I've been a church planter, and folks, it's tough at Christmas. You want to do something and you don't have money for it. And I'm going, yeah, there's little things our class could do just based on my own experience. So I'm sitting there thinking, okay, here's some things. My Sunday school class can become a part of this process, and we can do it pretty much unofficially. I mean, we can just kind of say, hey, Pastor, by the way, our class is going to adopt the church planter and his family and the staff, if there is any in this church plant, and we're just going to bless them with a little bit extra come about Black Friday next year. About that time where they're going, boy, I'd like to do this, but I can't. We just want to be a blessing. And there may be other things that you can do. But the ability to raise or develop resources, the lack of it, is a cause that many churches fail. And let me just encourage you to look at your membership. Who do you have in your membership that might be in the business of fundraising. Maybe they're working for financial institutions, and there are these untapped resources that have not been utilized to help train the church planner in budgeting and management. There are often resources in our church that they're not utilized because we don't ask them. We just simply don't make the connection. So when you're thinking about a church planning strategy, I'd like you to make a mental list of everybody in your church that you know of. The larger the church, it might be more of a leadership team. Are there members in that team who have skills and gift sets that could really be used in the church plant, especially as they relate to funding? Mistake number 7, the premature launch and the birth of the new work. Far too many churches are launched prematurely. It's because they usually have a lack of preparation and are driven by a calendar. Well, we've got to launch on Easter Sunday, or we have to launch, before the funding runs out. It can be a myriad of reasons. But if you remember the Field of Dreams, it's kind of like if you build it, they will come. Y'all remember that? Well, the reality is I've never met a church plant that when you put up the sign, service here in the mall, that the next thing you see is this line of headlights coming in. That hasn't happened. You see, you have to go out and fetch them. You've got to go out and reach the people, and signs aren't going to do it. Marketing is a good example of that. When I first started as a church planner back in the 1980s, if I sent out in direct mail 5,000 pieces, we could almost guarantee 200 showing up. It was very reliable in the 80s. 5,000 pieces of direct mail, 200 would show up. And that was really limited just by geography in a city. When you got to like 10 and 15,000, you'd be moving a little bit further away and the numbers would diminish. But many churches were able to predict how many you would have in that first service based on your direct mail. Today, a 5,000 piece direct mail will probably get you one person showing up, if that. So it's changed. We have to have a very personal touch. Facebook worked really good for a while. Churches were, there's whole strategy plans based on using Facebook marketing and social media marketing. Not going away from that, but I'm just simply saying it's diminishing returns because the novelty of that approach has worn off. And so we have to really go back to kind of the old pick and shovel, meaning it translates into hard work. And I go back to even Rick Warren's church. They did door knocking. One of the things, but they did a lot of it. And that was because the partnering churches give them an army of hundreds that went out door knocking for them. And so there's just a lot that you can do. Churches are using fairs and carnivals and innovative activities to draw the crowd. But if you don't have a really strong assurance of how many are going to be there, it will probably fail. Right now, a rough ratio is that you're going to get about 2.5 people for every core group member in your launch service. That's a pretty rough estimate, but about 2.5 people for every core person in your launch. It used to be a 10-to-1 ratio. So if you had 20 in your core team, you could launch with 200 and be pretty sure of that. Today, if you've got 20 in your core team, you're going to launch with about 50. That is a ratio that we are finding pretty consistent. And again, it's because there are so many church plants, denominations are doing them, and there's a lot more competition on Sunday afternoons, folks. You need to face that. You need to look carefully at the time. So a premature launch means you've not planned through those issues, you've not given them consideration, you've not counted the cost, and you're jeopardizing the health of the church down the road. Mistake number 6 is to panic during the 3-week slide syndrome. The 3-week slide syndrome is in that first month of the church. After the first month, you're going to usually go through a 3-week period where things are starting to look bad. The first few weeks, you tend to have a strong attendance. You tend to get some momentum. You tend to get people who are excited about it. They come, they visit the church, they tell their neighbor, and you start to grow. So you're going to get some growth in that first month, But somewhere early in the life of the church, you're going to have a convergence of events. And what happens is that everybody quits coming at the same time. You got families going on vacation. They decide, well, man, we've really enjoyed Sundays off. And the last few weeks we've been going to church. And man, we've loved it. We love the sermon. We love the fellowship. Let me ask you this. Who doesn't love your church? Satan was the answer I was looking at. There are other answers, I'm sure. Satan hates your church. He doesn't want your church to exist. He wants your church to fail. And suddenly, he will redouble his efforts. Your people are going to get sleeping sickness. They are going to become complacent. They are going to get lazy. They are going to have every excuse in the book. There comes this period, and what happens for about 3 weeks, you're going to just see massive threats to even sustaining attendance. And usually it just starts going down. I mean, we're talking up to a 50% drop in that 3-week period. And we've seen this consistently with church plants. What are some of the ways that you might counter that? What are some of the ways that you might counter that 3-week slide? Lots of prayer. Being aware of it, and preparing your leadership for it so they can pray about that. What else? Ownership. Explain what you mean by ownership, Wes. Right. And so, right. Yeah. Relationship. One of the things I found, and that is if you, with a new church, let somebody go a week without a follow-up visit, they don't show up Sunday and you wait another week, you've lost them. Follow-up relationship, high relationship in the early days of that church are going to be critical. And so you need to be aware of it, you deal with it, you pray about it, you prepare for it, you have a plan, and you follow it. I think Dr. Cheney wants to speak on this one, so hold on a second here.
One of the challenges of a 3-week slide is it's most prevalent, by the way, in launching large, is you build for the great day. And so often, you may have addressed this already, but so often planners will get depressed after they launch because, they're going to lose. If you launch at 2, you're going to be running 125, and they think, oh, what did I do? It's just what you run 3 weeks after you launch is usually what you're going to start your first year. That's the base, and most church planners haven't been taught that you're going to have some degree of that, and then they start their ministry where they should be the most excited. They start their ministry frustrated when they should begin to realize that's part of it. Not everybody's going to like a good-looking, bald-headed guy, and not everybody's going to like a young guy, and not everybody's going to like, and that's just part of it. And a lot of times our planners are just unaware that there will be a little bit of attrition from the launch, and it's just part of it. And sometimes they will spend an exorbitant amount of time wallowing in their pity when they're doing really well, and they shouldn't be all that negative about it.
As a sponsoring church, you can encourage them at this point, be faithful, be faithful, be faithful. Don't let them get overly discouraged. Conflict number 5, or mistake number 5, a conflict of values and agenda. Many a new work has been derailed or destroyed by conflicts in values and personal agendas. In the book, I use an illustration of a church that the planter had a couple of competing values. One is he really believed in all member participation. He wanted everybody to participate in the music and the worship and to feel like they could be a part of that aspect of church. He also had a value for excellence, and there was a young lady who had a disability, and the fact is she couldn't sing. I mean, if she was to sing the song Joyful, Joyful, it would sound like this. Joyful, joyful, we adore thee. I mean, it was, folks, we're talking bad, real bad. But he valued participation. He valued letting people that maybe weren't quality, but he also had a value of excellence. What happened? Somebody's going to lose. Either he's going to really frustrate the leadership and the worship and the music program, the worship team, because, hold it, you've been talking value, or he's going to frustrate those in his small group who have been taught, I value every member in ministry. I value inclusiveness. I value letting everyone participate. We have to identify and help our planners identify those conflicts of values that also get in place in the agenda. Here's an example from a church planner that I was working with in Kansas City. He said, Rod, my church plant's not doing well. My funding's running out. He had 3 years of funding. He had about 2 months left. The church was plateaued. He said, I don't have committed leaders. I can't get them to do anything. And I said, well, explain to me, what are you doing to work with your leaders? And he said, well, I can't get them to come to meetings, and I can't get them to come to training. Well, let's talk about your schedule. So what do you do on Mondays? He goes, well, Monday night's my day off. Sunday's busy, and so Monday's my Sabbath journey day. Great, I understand that. You need a day off. What do you do Tuesday night? Well, Tuesday night's my daughter's softball practice, so I'm at softball practice. Oh, okay. What do you do Wednesday night? Well, Wednesday night we have small group meetings, so I'm at small group. Okay. What do you do Thursday night? My son's in soccer, and man, I'm a good dad. I never miss a soccer game. Okay, well, what about Friday night? That's date night. My wife and I go out. That's our date night. Great. What do you do Saturday night? I do my sermon preparation, going over, making sure my sermon's good. Oh, so who's the problem? You see the value conflict? Family was a high value for this planter. When was he training his leadership? None. Because his schedule didn't allow for training the leadership when they were available. By the way, I faced that as a young church planter. Tom knows this story. My church planting training meetings were at 10 o'clock at night at Caro's Cafe. Because I got to, all of us were young, and we were able to that way have dinner with the family, tuck the kids into bed, say the prayers, and read them a story, and then we'd go over to Caro's, and we did our leadership development from 10 to 11:30 at night, once a week. Folks, if you have these conflicts of values and agenda, you have to help that church planter work with it, because how much are you going to grow without trained, equipped, encouraged, discipled leaders? None. Lack of leadership development. This dovetails into the value issue. Lack of qualified, committed leaders is not only a huge mistake, it's usually a mistake that the planter is making. He's not realizing that really everything that church is doing is going to rise or fall on the leadership that he is developing. Let me just once again remind you that the Great Commission only has one imperative, and that is to make disciples. Everything else flows from that, and that's what we need to be about, is making these disciples, because, again, going back to the value conflict, if we're not about doing that, you can be asking questions of that church plant. You can be asking questions of those leaders about how that process is going. In my last church plant, as the planter, and we're talking 2 years ago, I had 1 day a week for my church plant. 1 day a week. And as an administrator and professor, Monday through Friday, no way. Saturday was the day that I did sermon preparation, study preparation, family. And Sunday, I was at the church all day. And I focused basically exclusively on disciple making on Sundays. I would spend Sunday afternoon discipling, training up leaders, meeting with them. And in the period of about 6 months, we had a small group that we're now moving towards being equipped and prepared. Today, that church plant, going from the 22 that we had at the end of year one, all 22 of those leaders, including some that were youth, are still involved in the church. They are reproducing themselves either in that church or a church that has been sent out from that church. And they, in turn, have a value of discipleship and leadership. You truly can create that into the DNA. So ask questions. Is leadership development happening? And if not, why? Mistake number 2 is in the preaching and worship. Many church planners are not proficient in their planning for worship, their preaching. I've met many a church planner who struggles on Saturday night. What am I going to preach? You, again, are in a position that you can help guide them in developing some strategies to ensure that they understand how to how to deal with the realities of the rubber in the road. How many of you have taken a preaching class? Okay. How many of you were told that you need to spend 20 or more hours a week in your sermon preparation? Just about every hand. How many of you know from fact that's not reality? How many of your church planners know that yet? How many of them are still so enamored with their preaching professor? They're so enamored with what this man said that no, he can't be wrong. I must have 32 hours to prepare my 3 points in a poem or God can't use me. And they live under this guilt because folks, we need to give them some tools. I don't know what your tool is. A couple of tools that have been my favorite. One of them is called the Christian calendar. We just started a new year this week. Sunday was the beginning of a whole new year. First Sunday of Advent. Genesis chapter 3 is the theme. The fall of man. Why do we need the advent of Christ? Why do we need Christ? Well, the theme is the fall of man. Oh, good. I know what I'm preaching on. Week number 2. The failure of the law. Ooh, another good sermon topic. Week number 3. The promises of the prophet. Good sermon. Week number 4. The ministry of John the Baptist. Hey, that works good because I'm a Baptist. Preaching on a Baptist is not a bad thing to do. Okay? Ooh, Christmas Sunday. I know what I can preach on Christmas Sunday. And then, of course, you can preach on, Christmas has multiple themes, including the ministry of Christ, all that good stuff. Then we go into Epiphany. First Sunday of Epiphany, the ministry of the John the Baptist. I love that. You finally get the chronology right. They didn't show up in Bethlehem. The second Sunday of Epiphany, the baptism of Jesus. Dude, do you realize that the Christian calendar is giving us good theology? Because, see, how old was he when he was baptized? Wow. And the Christian calendar gave me, so as a young pastor, being in Lutheran land, i.e. northern Minnesota, where we were outnumbered, probably 200 to 1, preaching the Christian calendar was not only culturally appropriate, but it was very winsome. We need to make sure your church planners have some of these tools because in their preaching and worship, they need to understand that they have many responsibilities, but for them to be throwing together sermons and preaching something that they heard off of podcasts, God will occasionally give us grace to pull that off once. Have you found that to work very long? No. So we need to work with them on that. Mistake number 1 is forgetting to focus early on the spiritual dynamics. Prayer and the other spiritual disciplines. We're really about teaching them to incorporate those disciplines in their own life and in the lives of those that they're ministering to. You need to be asking questions about the planter's personal spiritual life. I was blessed with a good mentor in the first 3 years, and then I went through another period of about 5 years where I didn't have a mentor. I didn't have someone asking, Rod, are you reading the scripture daily? Tell me about your prayer life. Give me examples of what you're praying for. How can I be praying for you? And here's how you can pray for me. Things of that nature. Are you spending time alone with God? What about fasting? By the way, no one ever mentioned fasting to me in seminary. No one ever taught or mentioned fasting, really, until I was confronted with a crisis and a pastor friend came and said, well, Rod, according to Scripture, that kind of crisis, have you thought about fasting? That's what you deal with when you're facing that. Whoa, tell me about fasting. And I just really didn't know much about it. And so we can work with our church planners, help them understand these spiritual truths. Here's an action plan that can keep us bathed in prayer. Pray and ask God to raise up intercessors, not only in your family, but for your family and for your ministry. Early on in this process, make sure your church planter has that, and then hold them accountable to it. Ask them these questions about this. Make a list of prayer intercessors that you can ask to become prayer warriors. You know what I found is that many of the prayer warriors that I've had over the years have been a little bit surprising. They've not been the people I thought. Believe it or not, they all don't have white hair and are over 80. In fact, isn't that a shame that when we often think of prayer warriors, we think of little old ladies who are praying? Why aren't the vibrant men praying in our churches? Well, I found that many will if we ask them to, and if we give them things that are worthy to prayer. You know, men want to pray about spiritual warfare issues. They're not really quite as big on praying for Aunt Jemima's bunions. They really want to pray for stuff that matters. And I think that's what we need to understand. So when you're enlisting people to pray, are you asking them to pray for stuff that matters? Keep it current. Make that a part of your discipline each week, that church planter is sending out this prayer request. And you as a sponsor, one of your roles can be to hold them accountable to this. Invite them to join your team. You want to have 10 to 20 strong prayer intercessors. I have an inner group of 3. Tom has an inner group of 3. And I'll tell you what, they will pray for me at the drop of a hat. It's fun to have, and it's reassuring in ministry to know I have people I can call at 3 in the morning and know that they will not have any question of why I called. They just know if I call at 3 in the morning, it's because it's important. They probably will assume I've been grappling with something until 3 in the morning and now I'm calling them to pray. Because that's what God, you know what, if we don't have those kind of people in ministry, we're going to be struggling. And you may need to be that person for that planter and be one of those 3 inner 3 who can truly be there for them at any time. Clarify the covenant and prayer commitment. Just going back, and in your covenant, is prayer a part of it? I've read many a church planting agreement and covenant, prayers never mentioned. And that's going to communicate for the generations that we don't see prayer as important. Remember, prayer equals power. And then pray for your intercessors. Paul gave us the example of praying for the churches. I love reading Paul's conclusions where he's talking about who he's praying for and how he's praying for them. And then every year, just say, do we need to renew this action plan? The spiritual disciplines, you as a sponsor need to make sure that you're encouraging your planter to not lose track of that, because everything's going to be there seeking his time, his attention, his devotion. He's going to be dealing with budgets. He's going to be dealing with music issues. He's going to be dealing with new members. He's going to be dealing with stuff that, folks, we probably can't even imagine. Sometimes dealing with new believers, especially a large number of them. Y'all are aware, new believers don't necessarily act good, and people who are yet to be saved really act bad. I'll tell you, church planters, I've dealt with stuff that you wouldn't believe. As a church planter, well, you probably would, some of you. But as a church planter, let me just say, I've been shot at twice. I've had someone throw a firebomb through my window, which didn't go off, because they don't like it when you're preaching the Word of God. They don't like that. They don't like it when you're witnessing to their spouse, and they don't want to change. And so they're going through a lot of things that we in a traditional church, an existing church, don't have to struggle with. And so they need to know that you have their back and that you're there to encourage them in the spiritual disciplines. So that concludes the top 10 mistakes sponsoring churches make.
You might tell Rod in the book why there's a top 10.
He didn't get it. Now,
Would you mention in the book why there's the top 10 mistakes sponsoring churches make, but there's the top 20 mistakes
that the church planter makes. And the other thing I want to add is that in your PowerPoints, there are some additional slides that will go into some more detail, okay? We don't have time to cover all of that. I can either talk really fast and go click, 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 or do this. So in your slides, you're going to have additional material. The final session of this conference that I've been asked to lead is on the bivocational alternative. What I'd like you to do is stand, do a pirouette or something, and get the blood circulating, and we'll get started.